Okay, let's unpack this. 1.1% of the total budget in 1868. That's what Hungary actually allocated to education.
Yeah, just 1.1%. It's kind of staggering when you think about it.
It really is. I mean, consider this. It was less than what they spent renovating castles, apparently,
Hmm.
or even funding an expedition to East Asia.
Wow.
It really makes you think, what were their priorities right at that moment? And maybe more importantly, what happened next to change things so dramatically?
It certainly does make you reconsider what a nation values at different points, doesn't it?
Hmm.
But what's fascinating is that this seemingly low starting point sets the stage for a really remarkable evolution in their whole approach to education.
Exactly. And that's precisely the deep dive we're embarking on today. We've got some fantastic excerpts here from Education in the School Network of Arad.
Mm-hmm.
It lets us examine how this one city, Arad, within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, roughly, 1867 to 1918, completely transformed its educational landscape.
Think of Arad as like a lens, right? A way to understand the broader shifts happening across the empire during that whole dualism period.
Right.
I mean, this is a time of rapid modernization,
Mm.
and Arad, like a lot of places, faced this urgent need to, well, tackle widespread illiteracy,
Yeah.
adapt its workforce for industry and commerce, and really, foster intellectual growth.
And what strikes me is how relevant it all still feels, even if you're not like an education historian.
Yeah.
The challenges Arad faced, access, funding, the whole purpose of education in a society that's changing fast. These are debates we're still having today. It's history giving us these surprising echoes.
Precisely. And the insights we're getting today, they come from the work of Monty and Tibor,
Mm.
translated into English by Gabriel Roman.
Okay.
And this study, it really gives a comprehensive view. It traces development from the earliest kindergartens all the way through vocational schools, the famous gymnasiums,
Yeah.
the whole system.
So our mission today then is to dive into these excerpts. We want to pull out the key transformations, understand the hurdles they faced, and yeah, uncover those really compelling stories that bring this whole evolution to life.
Sounds like a plan. Where should we start?
Well, let's set the scene. The Austro-Hungarian Compromise has just happened, 1867. There's this growing awareness, this need for educational modernization. Why was that such a powerful driver right then?
Well, if you connect it to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
the compromise itself kicked off a whole new era. Big economic and social changes were happening.
Right.
And leaders like Edfaz Yosef, they really understood that for this new dual monarchy to actually work, to thrive, it needed an educated population,
Yeah.
people who could contribute to this modernizing state.
Okay.
He famously said,
Hmm.
and this quote really captures his conviction, "I regard the question of public education as the most important problem for the nation."
The most important.
Yeah, he was so committed, apparently he even threatened to resign to make sure they got enough resources.
Which makes that initial 1.1% budget figure in 1868 even more, well, jarring, doesn't it?
It really does.
You've got this top official saying it's the most vital thing, and yet it's funded less than, like, castle renovations. Were there maybe other huge national needs taking priority right at that moment?
That's a crucial question. And it's likely, a mix of things. Perhaps other areas, infrastructure, maybe national defense, were seen as more immediate concerns right after the compromise in the newly formed setup.
Makes sense.
But what's truly striking is the shift that happens after that. Our sources clearly show a steady, substantial increase in education spending over the next few decades.
Okay, so it wasn't just a blip.
Not at all. By 1907, under Apony Albert, the ministry that handled education was actually getting more funding than almost any other key ministry. Only a few got more.
Wow, okay. So eventually that commitment really did translate into serious money. What were the main goals they were trying to achieve with all this increased spending?
The goals were pretty ambitious, really, and kind of multi-pronged. First and foremost, there was this huge push to reduce the, frankly, alarming rates of illiteracy. It was really high.
Over 40%, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Way too high.
Yeah.
But beyond that, the vision was bigger. They wanted to cultivate a skilled workforce, essential for a modernizing economy, and also foster a generation of scientists, intellectuals, people who could compete with the rest of Europe.
So national progress on multiple levels.
Absolutely. Social, economic, intellectual. The whole package.
Okay, let's get into the nuts and bolts of this evolving system then. What did it actually look like for a kid growing up back then? What was their educational journey?
Well, initially, kindergartens, as we sort of know them today, they weren't really widespread.
Right.
So for most kids, around age 6 or 7, that's when formal schooling began. But the path they took after those first few years, it could vary quite a bit.
Right, there were different types of schools, weren't there? You mentioned folk schools, civil schools.
Exactly. The folk schools, they gave a basic education, usually maybe 6 to 8 hours a week.
Okay.
And for many kids, this basic schooling would be it, often combined with, apprenticeships in local workshops or factories.
Right, learning a trade.
Yeah. Then you had the civil schools. These offered a more practical curriculum. The idea was to prepare students for, like, lower-level admin roles, jobs in the growing industrial and commercial sectors.
So folk schools for the basics, civil schools for maybe low-skilled office or shop work.
Pretty much, yeah. Basic literacy and numeracy versus prep for those kinds of jobs.
And then secondary education was even more layered, it seems.
Oh, definitely. Secondary education was mostly split into two main tracks: the gymnasiums and the royal schools.
Okay.
Gymnasiums focus on a classical curriculum, heavy emphasis on Latin, Greek, that sort of thing. And that was the traditional route to university.
The elite path.
Kind of, yeah. Then the royal schools, they prioritized modern languages and what they called real subjects, so sciences, basically.
Ah.
And while there was some overlap, the type of final exam you took really decided your options for higher education. Gymnasium grads generally had wider access to universities. Royal school grads were often channeled more towards technical fields. It sounds like a pretty stratified system.
It does seem quite structured, quite rigid almost. But the text also mentions a growth in specialized schools beyond these main types.
Yes, and that really reflects the increasing specialization happening in the economy itself. You see agricultural schools popping up to improve farming, industrial schools to train skilled workers,
Makes sense.
commercial and vocational schools for trade and industry, and also pedagogical schools, teacher training colleges, basically to produce the teachers needed for this expanding system.
So a whole ecosystem of education developing.
Exactly. This diversification was absolutely crucial for providing the specific skills needed in such a rapidly changing society.
Let's zoom in on those early years then, the kindergartens. You said they weren't always standard. How did that develop?
Well, it's interesting because an 1891 law actually formalized their role. It defined their purpose as going beyond just, childcare.
Oh.
How so? They were seen as vital for instilling discipline, promoting cleanliness, order, and fostering kids' intellectual and moral development from a young age.
So proper preparation for schooling.
Kind of, yeah. And while they did become more common, there were still some major challenges.
Like what?
Overcrowding was a huge one. By 1914, the number of kindergartens had gone up a lot, but you often had situations with, like, one teacher trying to manage a class of over 100 little kids.
100. Wow, you can just imagine. That sounds incredibly tough.
Absolutely demanding. But it seems Arad was actually a bit ahead of the game when it came to early childhood education.
Really? How so?
Yeah, Arad had some interesting early efforts. There was this association of noble women that set up the very first kindergarten in the city way back in 1840.
1840, that's early.
It is, and the guy who led that first kindergarten is fascinating, Nagy Yosef. He was a pacifist.
Oh, wow.
Someone involved in the 1848 revolutions advocating for reform. He actually did time in prison for conspiracy.
No way. A revolutionary kindergarten founder.
Yeah. Later in life, he became a really prominent figure in Arad's education scene. Quite the character arc.
That's incredible. And later, the city itself got more involved in running kindergartens.
Exactly. The private ones just couldn't cope with the demand and the tuition fees. They were a real barrier for many families.
The cost. How much are we talking?
Well, the text mentions fees like 50 florins a month at one point.
Mm-hmm.
Compare that to an average weekly wage for a laborer, which was maybe around 6 or 7 florins.
Oof. Yeah, that makes it pretty inaccessible for most people.
Totally. So in 1883, the first city-run urban kindergarten was set up, and more followed. The Newman family, big local industrialists, also played a role, even helping poorer kids with fees.
Good to hear there was some support.
Definitely. And even the kindergarten teachers themselves, their pay wasn't great. Maybe 400, 500 florins a year basic salary mentioned at one point. Later, Aponi, the minister, responded to the mayor's lobbying and took over the city kindergartens, promising more state funding and expansion.
So a mix of private, city-run, and eventually state-supported effort.
Yeah, plus these summer shelters, apparently, for care during warmer months. A real patchwork of provision, really.
Okay, let's shift focus to primary education then. This sounds like it became a massive priority after the compromise, especially with illiteracy over 40%. You can see why.
Absolutely. And Eötvös's Public Education Act of 1868 was just huge, a real landmark.
What did it do specifically?
It mandated compulsory schooling for all kids aged 6 to 12. And crucially, it included waivers for fees for poor families. That really opened the door for so many more children.
So trying to make it truly universal, removing the financial barrier.
Exactly. It wasn't just talk. It spurred the creation of a whole network of these folk schools to supplement the existing church schools.
Mhm.
And this meant a massive effort. Building classrooms, training literally thousands of new teachers, developing and publishing textbooks, even translating them into the various languages spoken across the empire.
That's a huge undertaking. And did it work? Did attendance go up?
Dramatically. Attendance rates jumped from less than half of school-age kids initially to over 90% by 1913.
Wow, from under 50% to over 90%. That's phenomenal progress in what, 45 years?
It really is remarkable. It shows how effective those reforms were. And the curriculum in these folk schools, it was surprisingly broad.
Oh, yeah. What did they cover?
Everything from religion and basic literacy, numeracy, grammar,
Right.
speaking and listening, to geography and history, both local and general basic natural sciences.
Okay.
Even practical stuff relevant to rural life, like basic agriculture and horticulture, plus civics, music, physical, and even military-style exercises. Quite holistic, really.
That is a very broad range for basic schooling, but you mentioned language. That became a tricky issue, didn't it?
Ah, yes. This is where things get complex and definitely politically charged.
So.
Well, the initial principle was education in the child's mother tongue. Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But gradually, the teaching of Hungarian, the official state language, became more and more emphasized. This eventually led to the Lex Aponi laws, starting around 1907.
Lixaponi, what did they do?
Essentially, they tied state funding for minority church-run schools to how well their students could speak and write Hungarian.
Ooh, I can see how that would cause problems, especially in areas where Hungarian wasn't the main language spoken.
Exactly. It must have created huge difficulties and tensions. Could you elaborate maybe on the potential long-term social, cultural impact of a policy like that?
Well, the churches running schools for Romanians, Serbs, Germans, Slovaks, they argued quite reasonably, I think, that properly teaching Hungarian needed consistent daily use immersion.
Which just wasn't happening everywhere.
Right. Especially not in villages where everyone spoke Romanian or Serbian, for instance. It put a massive, often unrealistic burden on teachers and students. And you can imagine it might have fostered resentment, maybe even unintentionally strengthened those separate national identities rather than integrating them.
A real double-edged sword then.
Yeah.
So what was the situation like on the ground in Arad itself with language?
ERA initially had mostly denominational church-run schools. The city actually offered to take over these schools from the various churches.
Did they agree?
Eventually, some Catholic, Reformed, and Lutheran schools became city-run community schools. So the network of these community schools gradually expanded, enrollment went up, spending went up.
But I sense a but coming.
But overcrowding became a big issue again. A familiar story, right? Even today.
Still echoes, yeah. So what did the local powers that be in Arad do about the packed classrooms?
Well, the mayor was apparently a big education supporter, and the local paper Elfold often discussed the overcrowding problem. They even questioned if quality could be maintained with such huge class sizes.
Good point.
But despite the worries, there seems to have been this underlying optimism, that the money being spent would eventually lead to better quality overall.
And Aponi's visit in 1907, was that a turning point for Arad's infrastructure issues?
It seems like it. His visit led to this deal between the city and the ministry. They agreed to build 6 new folk schools, with state money helping out.
Ah, concrete action.
Yeah. But even with these new buildings, enrollment stayed incredibly high. Eventually hit 96% in Arad, which is amazing. We also see things like the nun school being founded around then, adding more options.
It's fascinating, too, hearing about the local Arad School Council. They weren't just rubber-stamping rules from Budapest, were they?
Not at all. This council, made up of local bigwigs, oversaw how national laws were applied locally and managed the city schools. They made some interesting calls, like a pretty controversial policy about married female teachers.
Oh, what was that?
I think they tried to restrict them, but happily it was ultimately rejected, so local views could push back.
Good to hear. And it also sounds like there was a push for more local control over the curriculum itself.
Definitely. That same newspaper, Alfold, was arguing for more autonomy for the Arad School Board. They felt locals knew best what the city needed, rather than just following ministry rules from afar.
Makes sense.
They even suggested involving teachers directly in designing the curriculum, which is pretty forward-thinking for the time, wouldn't you say? Shows real faith in local expertise.
It really does.
Yeah.
What about the teachers themselves? Did they have any kind of collective voice like a union or association?
They did. The Teachers Association of the Arid region was founded way back in 1870. Its goals were twofold: helping members with self-education, keeping up to date, and protecting their professional interests, pay, conditions, that sort of thing.
Like a professional body.
Exactly. They even had their own journal for a while, though it didn't last long. But what's amazing is the sheer range of stuff they talked about.
Oh, yeah.
Pedagogy, textbooks, sure. But also salaries, pensions, and the random things like animal welfare and beekeeping.
Beekeeping.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it paints this picture of teachers being really engaged with their profession, but also just their whole community.
Yeah.
And things like the Convictus, Hostel for Pupils, opening in 1906, that also shows the growing infrastructure supporting education in the city.
A really vibrant educational scene developing.
Totally. But let's bring it down to the people. We've talked systems, laws, but who are the teachers actually doing the work? Any standouts?
Absolutely. The text profiles 3 educators who really climbed the ladder, starting as teachers and becoming key figures in Arad's education system.
Oh, tell me about them. Individuals who really dedicated their lives to this.
Okay, first there's Sine Isvan. Starts as a teacher, becomes headmaster of the civil school, then eventually school superintendent for the whole district. He even wrote geography textbooks that were used all over the region.
Wow, quite the career path.
Then there's Niedermayer Tobias, an elementary school teacher who became famous locally for something incredible. Apparently, he managed to teach all 105 of his first graders to read, write, and do arithmetic in a single year.
105 in 1 year.
I know, right? Seems impossible. He later became director of the apprentice school.
A legend indeed. And the third.
Kovacs Vince, primary teacher, then school superintendent, eventually a public education counselor. He was really instrumental in getting new schools and cultural institutions established in Arad. Really dedicated individuals.
They really sound like it. But the text also hints that life wasn't always easy for the average teacher, especially in the villages. What were the financial realities like?
Yeah, that's the contrast. While these 3 had successful careers, many ordinary teachers, particularly out in the countryside, faced real financial hardship.
How bad was it?
Well, the minimum salary set by that 1868 law, it was only about 2.5 times what a day laborer earned.
Not much of a premium for being educated and responsible for kids.
Not really. Even in Arad, where pay was generally better than the villages, many teachers still struggled. Estimates from the time suggest that while a teacher with a family could, technically survive, there wasn't much left over after essentials. It's quite sobering thinking about the economics for the people doing this vital work.
Did that later 1907 law about teacher salaries help much? Did it improve things significantly?
It did set up a basic salary scale,
Yeah.
offer potential raises over time. But research suggests that even after that, a big chunk of teachers' families still lived below what was considered the minimum needed for an intellectual household to subsist.
So, still a struggle for many.
It really underscores the persistent economic challenges many in the teaching profession faced back then.
We've talked about the schools expanding, but what was the actual measurable impact on literacy within Arad itself? Did the numbers change?
Oh, the transformation was pretty significant. Between 1870 and 1910, the illiteracy rate in Arad dropped like a stone from 57% down to 29%.
Wow, nearly halved. That's a huge improvement in just 40 years.
It's a really remarkable progress.
Yeah.
But the text also adds a surprising little detail alongside that.
Oh, what's that?
Well, despite this really impressive proportional drop in illiteracy, the actual absolute number of illiterate people in Arad stayed almost the same.
Wait, how does that work?
Rapid population growth.
Yeah.
Arad was booming, attracting people. So while they were educating a much higher percentage of the population, the overall number of people grew so fast that the raw number of illiterates didn't really decrease much.
Ah, okay. That's a really important nuance. Looking at percentages alone doesn't tell the whole story.
Exactly. Good reminder for looking at historical stats.
How did Arad stack up against other big cities nearby, like Oradea or Timisoara, in terms of literacy?
Arad actually lagged a bit behind those two in overall literacy rates. But interestingly, in all 3 cities, literacy was consistently higher among the Hungarian-speaking population.
And what about the gender gap? Was there a difference between male and female literacy?
Oh, definitely. Initially, the gap was pretty wide. And it even got wider for a while as new schools were being set up.
Really? Why?
Probably reflects an initial societal bias,
Yeah.
focusing more on educating boys first.
Right.
But eventually, the city authorities seemed to recognize this imbalance, and they started taking steps to set up more schools specifically for girls.
That's good. Was there demand for girls' education?
Absolutely. The enthusiasm comes through loud and clear in reports from the time. The director of the Civil School for Girls wrote about being totally overwhelmed by parents desperate to enroll their daughters.
That's really encouraging to hear. The value placed on educating girls becoming clear.
It is. And the text also briefly mentions something else interesting, a specialized school for the deaf and dumb.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, founded in 1885 with quite a bit of city support. Under this really dedicated director, Roboz Yesef, who'd actually studied similar schools elsewhere in the empire, it became a highly respected center for educating deaf and mute children. Another layer to the educational provision.
Arad was clearly a melting pot, a diverse city. What about confessional schools? Schools run by different religious groups? What role did they play, especially in preserving different cultural identities?
Confessional schools were hugely important in Arad, and they had a long history, predating all these big state reforms we've been talking about.
Right.
They were absolutely crucial, not just for basic schooling, but for maintaining and promoting the specific cultural and linguistic heritage of their communities, Orthodox, Catholic, Jewish, Lutheran, etc.
And the Orthodox Church, it sounds like they had a particularly well-established system.
Yes, they ran a pretty significant network of elementary schools. They had qualified teachers, and apparently many schools even had orchards attached.
Orchards. That's a nice touch.
Isn't it? And by the 1870s, it was common for their students to be proficient not just in their native language, but also in Hungarian and German. Shows a real commitment to broader communication skills.
What about the Romanian community? Were they active in setting up their own schools, too?
Absolutely. The Romanian Women's Association was vital in founding the Romanian Civil School for Girls. They faced ongoing money problems, but managed to build a new school through massive community fundraising efforts. It really highlights how much they valued education.
That's dedication.
And then there was the Romanian Preparatory School, the Preparandia, founded way earlier, 1812. This was hugely significant, the first Romanian teacher training institute in all of Hungary.
The first one.
Yeah, it had a massive impact on Romanian culture. Many of its teachers and grads became leaders in the Romanian national revival movement. And the Theological Institute of Arad was also a key center for this cultural awakening, with big financial help from families like the Sainis.
So these schools were clearly about much more than just reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Oh, totally. They were deeply tied into preserving and promoting cultural and national identity for these different groups.
What about other communities? Serbs, Lutherans.
The Serbian Orthodox schools saw a gradual decline in enrollment, probably losing students to the growing state school system. The Greek Catholics had a school that eventually closed. The Lutherans struggled financially first with their schools, but later set one up that included practical craft training, slöjd-type stuff, a pragmatic approach.
And the Jewish community, they were also a big part of Arad, right? What was their educational setup?
Indeed. Under influential leaders like Rabbi Aaron Koren and others after him, the Jewish community developed a really well-organized education system. They had separate schools for boys and girls.
Okay.
And they increasingly taught German and Hungarian alongside Hebrew, recognizing the need for integration. Generous donations, like Baron Sana giving land, helped build modern schools. And figures like the Koren family were influential not just in education, but in industry, politics, showing how integrated and important the Jewish community was in Arad's overall development.
Moving towards more practical education. The civil schools, you mentioned them earlier, they seem tied to the growing need for skills in industry and commerce.
Absolutely. Civil schools were specifically set up to give students practical knowledge for jobs in industry, trade, and government administration. Unlike the classical gymnasiums, their curriculum was directly aimed at these vocational paths.
And Arad made a conscious choice to create one by changing the upper grades of some primary schools.
Yes, in 1872, they decided to create a dedicated civil school. It was initially housed in the old Miners' Gymnasium building, led by Sime Istvan, one of those educators we mentioned earlier.
Okay.
It faced some early financial wobbles, apparently almost closed down. But the government saw how vital these schools were for the economy, so they worked to define clear career paths for graduates, including things like government jobs with pensions. That made them much more attractive.
Gave students a clear goal. So the curriculum was very job-focused then.
Totally. Subjects included mother tongue and Hungarian, German, practical math and geometry, geography focused on industry and trade, basic science, some law, accounting, technical drawing, a clear shift away from liberal arts towards vocational training.
It's interesting the text mentions nostalgia for the old miners' gymnasium building when the civil school moved. People get attached to school buildings, don't they?
They really do.
Yeah.
Symbols of learning, memory. And it sounds like the civil school really took off in its new building. It did, especially under its long-serving director, Niedermeyer Paul Tobias, later called Almasi. It got so successful, enrollment grew so much, they eventually set up a second civil school just for boys.
Wow.
And around the same time, a state high school for girls was founded. Its curriculum even included practical subjects like kitchen chemistry.
Kitchen chemistry. Serious.
Apparently so. It just further highlights that growing emphasis on practical skills for both boys and girls.
Okay, let's talk even more specialized training. Arad had this strong craft tradition. How did formal vocational schools develop to support the trades?
Well, initially, apprentice training was pretty informal. Happened mostly in workshops, maybe with some basic theory in Sunday schools.
Right.
But after the compromise, people realized they needed more structured vocational education. So they set up a lower vocational school and an industrial school for women teaching things like knitting and tailoring.
But there was an ambition for something more advanced, wasn't there? Given Arad's reputation for skilled artisans.
Exactly. The Minister of Commerce, Baras Gabor, saw Arad's potential as a real hub for skilled trades. So funding was secured in 1892 to establish a serious vocational school, specifically focused on wood and metals industrialization.
Wood and metals. Very specific.
Yeah, and they adopted this highly regarded German model, the Württemberg school model.
How did that work?
It cleverly combined theory taught in the school with loads of practical training out in the workshops of local master craftsmen. Best of both worlds, really. Students got the principles and the hands-on experience.
That sounds like a really smart, well-rounded approach. What kind of subjects did they study besides the actual craft skills?
Alongside woodworking and metalworking, they did basics like spelling, arithmetic, geometry, accounting, technical drawing. They were serious about quality teaching, too. The first permanent teacher was even sent abroad on a scholarship to study the best vocational ed practices.
Investing in the teachers.
Absolutely. The whole curriculum emphasized both classroom learning and lots of real-world practice.
And it sounds like this school quickly gained a good reputation.
Oh, definitely. High standards, strict rules about exams and attendance. It became known for excellent teachers and really skilled students. They even won prestigious Grand Prix awards at international exhibitions.
Wow. Showing off Arad's skills on the world stage.
Exactly. And there were other related vocational initiatives nearby too, suggesting a wider regional push for skilled workers.
Makes sense for a growing industrial and commercial center like Arad. Which brings us to commercial education itself. How did that side develop?
Well, commercial education actually started quite early in Arad. Private commercial schools popped up, and there was even a Royal Main School for the Jewish community established back in 1836, which was pretty progressive for the time. Figures like Steinitzer Farkas and Moses Herschel were key in those early days.
And these private schools continued alongside the more public ones.
Yeah, like Roder Janos's private commercial school. It grew into a well-respected four-year institution, even had boarding facilities. And prominent local figures like Daniel Neumann and Varjasi Arpad, involved in all sorts of Arad's development, also had ties to commercial education.
But eventually there was a feeling they needed something more advanced. A real trade school focused just on higher commercial skills.
Precisely. The local trade association really spearheaded that. They raised funds and picked Abre Lajos, a dedicated teacher really passionate about commercial ed, to set up what became the Academy of Commerce.
Okay.
And showing his dedication, Abre actually went on a study trip to Germany to check out their best commercial schools first.
Doing his homework. And this Academy of Commerce became a big deal in Arad.
Oh, yeah. Opened in 1885, initially as the Higher School of Crafts, but quickly evolved into the Academy of Commerce. Had its own building, boarding school. The curriculum was tough, covered a huge range of commercial subjects.
That's demanding.
It really was. Its reputation grew so much, it started attracting students even from Budapest. The text details this incredibly packed daily schedule. They had highlights how serious it was. And the graduation exams. The example given for commercial arithmetic looks seriously challenging.
Rigorous training for the business world. Now, none of this expansion works without good teachers. How did teacher training specifically evolve in Arad?
You're right, teachers are key. Recognizing this, that 1868 People's Schools Act mandated pedagogical schools for teacher training, and Arad became a really important center for this.
Okay.
The second state teacher school in the city opened in 1873, initially sharing space with the Royal Gymnasium. And remember, there was already an Orthodox teacher training school there, too.
So multiple institutions focused on producing teachers. Did they get good people to lead them?
Yes, they aimed high. Mikovich Laszlo, a big name in teacher training, was appointed first headmaster of the new state school, though sadly he died before it even opened.
Oh, no.
Yeah. But his successor, Gajdos Joseph, showed real commitment to quality. He went on a study trip to Germany and the Netherlands to learn about the best, most modern teachers' practices.
So really aiming for excellence. What were the expectations for these future teachers? What was their role supposed to be?
The expectations were incredibly high and really broad. Contemporary materials like Hungarian pedagogy saw teachers as vital community figures, way beyond just the classroom.
How so?
They were expected to promote public health, share agricultural knowledge, foster music skills, even raise awareness about fire safety in their communities.
Wow, that's a lot of hats for one person to wear.
It really is a huge, multifaceted role.
So with responsibilities like that, the teacher training curriculum must have been intense.
Oh, incredibly broad.
Yeah.
Covered religion, morals, pedagogy itself, deep subject knowledge, languages, sciences, economics, law, music, drawing, PE, even practical skills like bookbinding and, yes, beekeeping again.
Beekeeping for teachers, it keeps coming up.
Seems it was considered a useful skill. And because materials were scarce in many rural schools, trainees also had to learn to make their own teaching aids, fostered creativity, resourcefulness.
That's smart.
Arad's institute actually won a national prize for the quality of the teaching aids its students made.
Impressive. It sounds like they were trying to equip teachers with a huge range of knowledge and skills. What about the students themselves? Who went into teacher training?
They came from all over Hungary, but lots from nearby counties. Many had been to civil schools, but some came from the more academic gymnasiums and royal schools, too.
Okay.
Interestingly, the dropout rate was quite high initially. Probably reflect how demanding the training was, the high expectations. The final exams were super tough, broad knowledge across tons of subjects, practical problem solving, even answering questions in multiple languages.
Wow.
Even details like the cost of boarding and the precisely calculated food rations give you a sense of the structured, demanding environment.
So the state invested a lot in training them, but did they manage to keep these qualified teachers in teaching? Or did they leave for better paying jobs?
That was definitely a challenge sometimes. Despite the state's investment, some graduates did leave for better pay elsewhere. But the text also has inspiring stories, like Mudin Imre,
Oh, yeah.
talented student from the Arad Pedagogical Institute, went on to become an Olympian in shot put.
No way. An Olympian teacher trainee.
Yeah, shows the diverse talents nurtured even within these specific training institutions.
Okay, finally, let's look at the very top of the secondary system in Arad. The Royal Gymnasium and the Royal Real School. These sound like the most prestigious schools in town.
They certainly were. The Royal Gymnasium had this long, distinguished history going back to the 18th century Minorite Gymnasium. It was seen as a real intellectual pillar in Arad and the whole region.
And the story behind its new building is pretty wild, involving a big inheritance.
Yeah, it's quite a tale. Funding for the impressive new building came from this complex, long drawn-out inheritance from a woman named Bibikne Tomjan Marjet, dating back to 1774.
Wow. Took a while.
Involved legal fights, but eventually a big chunk of her estate went to finance the building. Cost a fortune. And interestingly, the Romanian government actually paid compensation for the land much, much later. Shows the long financial ripples of these investments.
And the academic standards at the Royal Gymnasium were top-notch, right? Feeding students into university.
Absolutely. They got a dedicated, highly respected headmaster, Savabi Paul. The admission process was tough. It quickly got a strong reputation across the region, had great libraries, lots of extracurriculars focused on intellectual development.
And the Royal School. It was in the same building, but different.
Yeah, established within the gymnasium building, but with different aims. Less focus on classics like Latin and Greek, more on modern subjects, especially natural sciences. It apparently had a few teething problems establishing its own identity. Some people initially thought it should be more like a trade school, but it also grew into a really important, respected institution.
It's interesting to think about the social status of teachers then. You said pay wasn't always great, but they were often respected figures.
That's a key point. Their social prestige was generally pretty high, especially secondary school teachers, seen as community pillars, intellectuals.
But not always smooth sailing.
No, the text hints at occasional clashes between citizens and teachers, so not always harmonious. And interestingly, despite the higher status of secondary teachers compared to primary ones, there seems to have been surprisingly little connection or collaboration between the two levels professionally.
Separate worlds almost. But clearly, the Royal Gymnasium and Royal School were vital intellectual hubs for Arad, weren't they? Nurturing talent, shaping future leaders.
Absolutely. The text lists a remarkable number of influential teachers and their achievements across different academic fields. Getting into these schools was a big financial commitment for families, though. Right. Enrollment stats show shifts over time, more native Hungarian speakers, fewer native Romanian speakers attending these elite schools as the years went by. The curriculum was incredibly demanding. The list of subjects for an 8th grader in 1888 is huge. And the baccalaureate exam excerpts. Seriously rigorous stuff.
And did these schools produce successful graduates?
Oh, massively so. The list of notable alumni is impressive people who excelled in science, politics, arts, you name it. Research even ranks Arad's Royal Gymnasium and Royal School among the absolute elite high schools in all of historical Hungary.
Really? Top tier.
Yeah. Census data from 1910 confirms Arad as a major intellectual center, with a high proportion of high school grads compared to other cities, which makes the final reflection in the text quite poignant.
What's that?
The reflection on the loss of so many of these intellectuals after the Treaty of Trianon redrew the map. It really drives home the impact of investing in or, tragically, losing a highly educated population.
A powerful point to end on for the main body. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Arad's educational journey, what are the main takeaways for you? What stands out?
Well, we've seen this truly remarkable expansion, haven't we? Across all levels, from kindergarten right up to elite secondary schools.
Definitely.
And a clear, purposeful diversification. Different schools for different needs, societal, economic. Plus, those huge sustained efforts to tackle illiteracy. And you can't forget the development of teacher training. Absolutely vital.
Yeah.
And finally, yeah, the emergence of those top schools, the gymnasium and Royal School, as real intellectual engines for the city.
And there were definitely some surprising bits along the way. That initial tiny budget for education, despite all the rhetoric,
Yeah.
the tough financial realities for many teachers, the sheer ambition of the curricula, even down to kitchen chemistry and beekeeping, and then the impressive success of the graduates later on, it all paints a really vivid picture.
Absolutely. And connecting it to today, it really makes you think about those timeless questions, doesn't it?
Like what?
You know, the balance between classical versus practical education,
Yeah.
the role of the state in funding and controlling schools, how we tackle equity and access for everyone, and maybe most crucially, how do we make sure we have a well-supported, highly trained teaching profession? These are still huge debates.
You really are. Which leads us perfectly into our final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener.
Okay.
Considering Arad's incredibly rapid, ambitious educational buildup during this whole period, and then that subsequent profound loss of intellectuals after Trianon changed everything, what are the long-term, often unseen consequences when a city, a region, a nation invests heavily in education or neglects it?
It really forces you to think about the lasting impact, doesn't it? The impact of the educational systems we're building right now and the kind of future they're actually shaping, perhaps in ways we don't even fully see yet. Something to mull over.